Welcome to the League of American Orchestras podcast series exploring the innovative practices described in Fearless Journeys, Innovation in Five American Orchestras. I'm Catherine Maciariello, your host for our discussion. The League published Fearless Journeys in 2010. The book takes us inside five creative organizations: the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, the Pacific Symphony, the Los Angeles Philharmonic, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, and the Memphis Symphony Orchestra, showing how they overturned conventional assumptions about programming, organizational culture, and community engagement, and discovered new strategies and pathways to success. Fearless Journeys was made possible by a generous grant from the MetLife Foundation with additional support from the National Endowment for the Arts. The book is available as a downloadable PDF as well as for Kindle and EPUB from the League's website at americanorchestras.org. I'm joined here by a terrific group from the Pacific Symphony: Carl St.Clair, Music Director, John Forsyte, President, and Eileen Jeannette, Vice President of Artistic and Orchestra Operations. Also with us is Joseph Horowitz, who serves as Artistic Advisor to the orchestra. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, Kathy.
Fearless Journeys describes the Pacific Symphony's approach to contextual programming and discusses the differences between what some people typically think of as thematic programs and programs that resonate more deeply and broadly within the environment, culture, or community in which the orchestra lives every day. Like the Los Angeles Philharmonic, whose seasonal platforms we examine in another podcast, the Pacific Symphony is concept-driven and context-based in its programming, creating connections to ideas that provoke, move, and inspire audiences. So, Carl, I'd really like to start with you as music director. When you talk about contextual programming, you mean a lot more than a concert or series of concerts that are loosely linked by a single idea. Could you explain briefly, from your perspective, the difference between simply creating a program around a theme and creating context around a program?
Well, the way I look at programming, each piece that's placed on a season is a very special moment that is shared between a music director or conductor and its orchestra and the orchestra and its audience and its community. It has to fill a much larger variable in the season and in the life of the orchestra. Take, for example, a few years back, it came to me that the influences on the younger generation of American composers did not come from Europe, as it had in the first part of the century to the middle part of the century, but in fact that most of the important influences on composers were coming from Asia. So based on this simple thought and premise, we developed an entire 3-year look at the non-European influences on the American composer. And the first was called Trade Winds from China. Now, when we think of that, Trade Winds from China, what can that mean? So, first of all, we engaged several composers who are and were directly related by the Cultural Revolution: Bright Cheng, Zhou Long, Chen Yi, Tan Dun, Joan Huang. We got our Chinese-American League involved. We placed many of the concerts in and around the Chinese New Year's. The following year, we explored programs from Indonesia with our program called Illuminations, where we talked about the music of John Adams and George Crumb and Colin McPhee. We involved gamelons from Indonesia, Javanese gamelons. And then the third year, we brought it home to explore the uncharted beauty of Lou Harrison. So we took a very simple premise or idea that the composers of today in America are being influenced by China. And then we put that into a large 3-year program. And that helped us connect very deeply with our very large Asian American community, our Chinese American community, and also allowed our musicians to experience music that they would not have experienced before, to engage with living composers that they might not have otherwise, to perform with instruments such as pipa and erhu, which is not a daily part of American orchestral life. So through this simple idea, we've contextualized something that lasted a 3-year span of time, and I think went a long way to help us connect to this demographic of our community. Because in my feeling, success of a symphony orchestra simply means how that orchestra serves its community.
That's really interesting, and what you describe is a very large multi-year project which gives you multiple ways to connect with audiences and multiple ways to explore ideas. I mean, I remember the days when I was managing orchestras that the music director simply delivered a list of programs and was done with it. But things have changed significantly, certainly at the Pacific Symphony. As music director, though, you're the primary steward of the orchestra's artistic profile, and I think about that in the way you approach this 3-year project. Yet, as Fearless Journeys tells us, you also actively engage others in developing programming ideas. Could you tell us in general how ideas get placed on the table? What makes an idea compelling for you, and how do you sift through all the good ideas to arrive at a final concept?
Well, you're absolutely right, and I'm certainly not the kind of music director that delivers per email a list of works that I'm going to do and figure the rest out by yourself. I mean, I love being a team player, with John and Eileen and Joe and all of our other staff members. We have a great time. I mean, we create this huge bucket, and it's sort of like becomes our bucket list, if you will. And ideas get on the table in so many different ways. For instance, in 1992, I was actually sitting on the tarmac at Logan Airport in Boston reading an interview with Art Buchwald, the famous columnist, because we were sitting there for like hours long. And I remember reading this interview, and one of the questions was, Art, what do you do when you have guests come to Washington, D.C.? What is the one thing you don't allow them to miss? And he just said, the wall, referring to, of course, the Vietnam Wall. And he just said, it's just waiting for music. And just that simple, it's just waiting for music, that was the real seed that helped me and gave me the impetus to commission the Vietnam Oratorio that we premiered in 1992 from Elliot Goldenthal. And sometimes it's just like a single word. Like I came up with this word about departures. I was thinking of Tchaikovsky's last notes and Mahler's last notes and Bruckner's last notes, and I was thinking, wow, these composers departed this earth, and what wonders they left us. And so from the word departures came, Mahler 9, Bruckner 9, Tchaikovsky, and basically was the unraveling of the entire music unwound. Sometimes it's the title of a book. John says, well, there's The Greatest Generation, Tom Brokaw, it's a fantastic book, and then all of a sudden, The Greatest Generation is the next theme, or was last year's theme for our American Composers Festival. Well, it turned out that Tom Brokaw's mother lived in Orange County. He became very involved with the festival, made us a wonderful documentary and statements, and it gave birth to Michael Daugherty's piece, Mount Rushmore, which is his first large choral work.
Joe, I'd like to turn to you for a second. You have a unique role with the orchestra as the artistic advisor who brings lots of experience in contextual programming and thematic programming, scholarly research at a deep level that informs the projects that the orchestra does. I wonder if you could briefly take us through one idea that you were involved in from its conception to execution, and talk about the steps that you took to flesh it out, who was involved at each stage, and in particular, were there any problems that arose, and how did you go about solving them, and did the idea change at all, and if it did, why?
Well, I knew you would ask me this question, so I've given it some thought, and the two priorities that I found myself thinking about were, one, acquisition of expertise, and two, maximizing collaboration. And I can tell you how that worked with reference to a single festival, Sonidos de Mexico, a Mexican festival which comprised 5 concerts. I counted them, 10 composers, including 3 living composers. This began with Carl saying he wanted to do a Latin American Composers Festival. I suggested that was a great idea, but pretty broad in its span. Why don't we just do Mexico? People like that idea. And the next hurdle was, since we like to do new music and commission it, whom to commission. And I've been fortunate to assemble a kind of Mexican brain trust through my work in D.C., where we do a lot of Mexican repertoire. I went to Leonora Saavedra, who is a Mexican music historian at UC Riverside, not so far from Orange County. And Leonora assembled for Carl and for me a 3-CD set excerpting new work by living Mexican composers. Carl and I had the experience of each individually listening to these CDs without talking to one another, and then finding that we had both identified the same composer, Anna Lara, whom neither of us had ever heard of, as the composer we wished to commission. We thereupon discovered a work of hers with a very long title beginning with the word Angels, which was in 4 movements and had already been premiered by, what was it, Carl? Was it the Long Beach Symphony that had premiered that work in its entire, or was it in Mexico?
It was in Mexico with Enrique de Mec, but it was in Mexico City.
So the rest of the story is very interesting, at least to me. Carl is an exceptionally thoughtful and painstaking programmer, and he was attracted to this piece, and at the same time he felt it was too long for a program where he wanted to do a gamut of Mexican music, and in fact 6 composers wound up on that program. And he took pains to do things that other music directors would not. And it was not the first time. We had almost the same experience with the Joe Long piece, where he went to the composer and he said, I would really love to do this piece. Maybe we can just do 2 movements. And he suggested the 2 movements he thought would work. She agreed. So we wound up doing Angels of Darkness and Dawn only. And typically, in my experience with Carl, the composer was so bowled over by his dedication and expertise that her view of the work actually changed. Carl took the piece much more slowly than she had envisioned. And we all bonded with Anna. We did 3 other works of hers on the festival, but we also wound up commissioning a work for organ and orchestra from her as a result of this experience. So that was the first step. Maybe I could just mention one other. I went to Gregorio Luque, who at that time was running the Latin American Museum in Long Beach, and excitedly told him we were going to do a Mexican festival, and Gregorio was himself Mexican. And I said we're going to do not only Revueltas and Chavez, but we'll do living composers, and we'll even do Manuel Ponce. And he said, that's a terrible idea. All you're going to do is perpetuate stereotypes of Mexico as a Hispanic culture, whereas in his view, and Gregorio is a hyperbolic personality, Mexico is the most polyglot culture on earth. So he said, you should do something that's never been done before. You should survey the entire range of Mexican culture in its diversity. And we wound up actually attempting that in one of the ancillary events, where we began with pre-Hispanic music, or its rough equivalent in the case of Xochipilli by Chavez. We sampled Mexican Baroque, Salon music by Mexican composers from the late 19th century, Ponce, Chavez, Revueltas, contemporary music. And we also, on that same program, engaged the Ballet Folklorico from the Orange County High School of Performing Arts, partly just because we wanted to fortify our existing ongoing collaboration with that school as a partner in the American Composers Festivals. And the same program included the Cal State Long Beach Chorus. So we're always looking to partner with area schools as much as we can.
This is incredibly interesting, and I think, one can see how quickly projects become complex and multifaceted. And John, I'm sure that there is a lot of groundwork that goes actually into preparing fertile ground for projects like this to emerge and be successful. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. You've mentioned to me before about the embarrassment of riches you have in Southern California, and for the benefit of those who are listening in, I wonder if you could apply your experience to orchestras in other communities. How might an artistic team determine that an idea is likely to resonate? How would they go about finding their own local resources to support its development? At what point do they involve community partners? Just in general, how could you translate your experience for those who might be listening?
Well, I think it's timely because we were just talking earlier today about a separate issue, but the idea of an advisory committee and identifying leaders in the community who are really touching the different veins and energy that's occurring within their community. So that could be the head of a local community foundation, to the head of the United Way, to a college president, to the mayor. I mean, there's so many people that can help to enrich a narrative for an orchestra. And I think, so we, for example, in Los Sonidos, reestablished a Hispanic Advisory Committee, which had been moribund for a number of years. And I have to say that it was fertile soil because Carl, relatively early in his tenure, and my predecessor, Luis Visto, were very much behind outreach to Santa Ana. And Santa Ana, which is a community comprised largely of Hispanic Americans, has hosted the orchestra for a number of years. Our rehearsal facilities and offices were there. And so there's always a sense that the city of Santa Ana was one of the reasons why we survived our very early years, but also because people were gradually becoming assimilated in Santa Ana. There was a wealthier, more established American population. And when I think about Los Sonidos, there was some initial artistic impetus, but then it became emblematic of this journey that Mexican Americans are going on in our own community, that the idea that there's new immigrant populations that have a tradition with classical music, even if they're coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds. That was a very big discovery when someone on the Hispanic Advisory Committee said, my father picked strawberries and listened to opera every day, so classical music is ours. And in a way, what happened was the fertile ground was cultivated by the fact that people started to passionately advocate for classical music in their lives, to the point that the Consul General of Mexico opened the door to Univision, and Univision did a 5-part documentary on Pacific Symphony's festival, talking about the fact that classical music is ours too. So it's kind of like a domino effect. You don't know what you're going to get, but there's this energy that starts to feed upon itself if the theme resonates. And I would just say that the thing that was clear to me and was clear to the Hispanic Advisory Committee was that we were very humble when we came to the table. We said, we've been trying initiatives for years in your community, and they haven't really worked. We've brought concerts. We brought the orchestra to Santa Ana, often with poor attendance. So what's going to be different this time? And one of the things they said is, well, one thing that's different is you seem to be really curious. You're not coming with a defined agenda. You're simply defining a concept for us. And so what they said was, no matter how ambitious you are with the festival, the real key is going to be persistence. It's going to be remaining close to our community, being in touch and having an agenda, and ultimately recognizing that in our community, families matter. So what has resulted in is a sequence of concerts that have resulted from Los Sonidos. We've done several additional programs, but more importantly, now we're starting a relationship with a charter school in Santa Ana, and our goal is to develop a symphony orchestra, a youth symphony orchestra in Santa Ana, serving largely Hispanic American students. So, the roots and branches kind of explode when you start a conversation. And I think one shouldn't be intimidated to simply start asking questions of people, regardless of what agenda may flow from that.
Well, I think what I'm hearing you say are there are several principles that anyone can apply. Be open to the resources that are available in the community, even if they may seem non-traditional or they may seem inaccessible, or you may not have had success in the past. Be persistent, be humble, and be open. And I think that's really good advice for folks as they try to explore partnerships and local resources. I'd like to turn for a second to Eileen, because there are so many threads and so many paths that have to be integrated in order to make these large-scale projects and sort of complex conceptual ideas successful. And Eileen, you often call yourself an integrator, mother, lots of other names. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about your role within the organization in keeping what can be a loving tension at the table from breaking down into disarray. How do you keep this process moving forward in positive ways and keep the musicians and the artistic staff and the administrative staff and the community partners all moving toward a common goal?
Well, when we talk about loving tension, I want to be clear in saying that it isn't really tension between the individual people that we're talking about, because everybody who's at the table is so incredibly passionate about the work that we're doing and 100% committed. And I think the tension actually comes more from the points of view that everybody represents. You know, Carl's worrying about what's good for the orchestra and how to connect best with our community. Joe is looking at intellectual and scholarly ideas, trying to find something new and sometimes radical for us to do. John is always thinking about the good of the institution as a whole, and can we get funding for any given project from ticket sales or grants, or is some particular donor going to be willing to help us fund something? I'm worrying about time, physics, and ease of execution and money, and all of the team members, we work together and ultimately an idea gets made stronger because we have this kind of loving tension at the table. For an example, our Tchaikovsky program that we did earlier this year, we were struggling a little bit with exactly what to present to our audiences. We're in a rather conservative part of the country, and we were struggling with whether or not to talk about Tchaikovsky's life and his lifestyle and how open we could be about that. But actually, from all of those many, 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 many conversations that we had, and there were many, ultimately the concert and the project became much stronger because we talked about it so much and we looked at it so very carefully from many, many angles. And my role is really to take those ideas and take all the partners and to make sure that things are executed to the best of our ability. And I sometimes liken myself to a bit of a White House spokesperson to make sure that everybody, staff, musicians, our partners, knows, the what, the where, the why, the when, and the how of what we're doing.
So what you're talking about really is, again, a complex process, and even with all the careful management, I'm sure that there are things that don't always go as you plan. And one of the greatest learning moments, I think, in any of these projects is when things don't go perfectly. I'm wondering, John, if there's anything that you have bitten off, thanks to your enthusiasm and your really broad artistic curiosity, that led you to make any mistakes in execution or to take on something that was too big for you. Anything that you would like to share with our listeners that would help them avoid similar experiences?
Us make a mistake? I find that astonishing. No, actually, many, and it's been very evolutionary. I'd say we've invested a great deal in elegant festival catalogs, CD-ROMs, DVDs, and website content to support the concepts that we espouse in our festivals, and I'm not entirely sure that they've had the utility that some thoughtful comments from the stage can have, or even interaction after a concert. I think some of the most poignant moments have happened in the concert hall, or in an advisory committee meeting, or on the site. So sometimes just the enormous amount of time and expenditure to prepare ancillary materials, I find a question. And I think today we have actually a greater opportunity to distribute this material and communicate it effectively than we did maybe 5 to 10 years ago with social media and so forth. So that's one area. I'd say when we think about non-subscription events that did not have a significant partnership involved, it was extremely difficult to sell it. So we have something we've called ancillary activities or ancillary events in a festival. And when we've partnered with Chapman University or the Newport Beach Film Festival, which have extensive networks of relationships or a built-in population, then something that can be quite sophisticated can be leveraged dramatically. And then finally, I would say not every theme will resonate with a local audience, and then some are a huge home run. So the Greatest Generation project, which we had this last spring, turned out to be, I think, a very powerful emotional experience, not unlike Los Sonidos, where there was tremendous pride that a generation was being celebrated. And just the mere act that was initiated by Eileen and her staff of inviting veterans into the lobby to greet patrons, veterans of World War II. We had a sort of a memorial tree in the lobby where people could write notes and write memories and make a contribution to a veterans fund. And simple acts of reaching out to the community like that were as powerful in some ways as the concert itself. and how open many of these veterans who had not come to our concerts before were to new music, and it was a complicated programming festival. On the other hand, we did a festival called Pulse, which we all thought was going to be a home run. It was a percussion-based festival. It had great works on it, but somehow we weren't able to create, it wasn't really thematic in a sense. It wasn't necessarily contextual. It had great works, all about rhythm, featuring great percussionists, and ultimately it wasn't as successful. And I'm not sure, maybe Carl or Eileen can reflect back on it, but it was really a challenging festival. And it was the close of our first year in the concert hall. We were very proud of it artistically, but it did not create ripples in the community that persisted.
That's an interesting observation, and I've heard it from other folks, too, who've talked about the difficulty of connecting with an audience when the context is too abstract. And I think the difference between what you're describing with The Greatest Generation and with Pulse is evidence of how that works. The Greatest Generation was an incredibly personal, there was a personal foundation to that allowed people to make connections that were not abstract at all, but quite tangible. As we bring the conversation to a close, and I'd like to ask you all just one last question, and if you could just share with us one or two sentences, that would be great. What you're describing in terms of what worked and what didn't is really what it feels like to live with innovation. Living with innovation is hard. Commitment is easily challenged, and especially these days when the economic times are so difficult. And I wonder what you're thinking about, what questions you're asking yourselves as you become more sophisticated, as you gain more experience both in engaging audiences and in navigating these complex programming processes. And what advice do you have for your colleagues who are trying to answer these questions? Eileen, you want to go first?
Sure. I think one thing to always remember is that it doesn't always have to be complicated. Sometimes the most simple to execute idea can make the biggest difference with your audiences. So everybody can think like that. John?
I think that it's a great joy for an orchestra to open itself up to inputs from as many locations as possible, but also recognize that at the end of the day, we are in a position to create something tasteful and something meaningful, and that there is, in other words, a bridge between community ideas and artistic excellence that we always must keep in mind. And that openness is a very powerful resource for symphonies.
And that's beautiful. Carl, we started with you, so let's end with you.
I think we need learning without lecturing, and I think we need to lead to a moment of revelatory involvement with our audiences. I began my comments earlier by saying that success for me equals service to our community. My overriding philosophy during my 20 years of being music director of the Pacific Symphony has been it's more important for us to be locally acclaimed than it is for us to be nationally recognized. John used a word earlier that I want to put in big letters. The word was family. We speak about family a lot with the Pacific Symphony. I talk very often from the stage to a group of people that I consider the Pacific Symphony Orchestra's family. I think to embrace your community, to listen to it, and then to make your decisions based on their voices is an important step towards this idea of serving one's community.
What a wonderful way to end. I'd like to thank all of you, Carl, John, Eileen, and Joe, for your very interesting perspectives, and we certainly wish you well in your continued work. For more information, we invite our listeners to contact the Pacific Symphony and to read Fearless Journeys. Just a reminder, Fearless Journeys is available as a downloadable PDF as well as for Kindle and EPUB from the League's website at AmericanOrchestras.org. Thank you for joining us.